At daybreak the world was grey, and close to the ground hedges beaded with dew, and the road a ribbon of pale clay running between fields just woken from sleep. The caravan gathered itself like a long breath, beasts stamping, men tying last knots and testing buckles with quick tugs of their hands. A bell on the lead mule sounded once, thin and hollow in the damp, and then again as the line eased forward, hooves pressing crescents into the soft verge. No one hurried. The pace of burdens is older than thought, measured out by breath, by step, by the slow yielding of distance. The smell of wool, leather, and oat mash rose in mild warmth as the morning widened. Pack horses went first, each with bales bound in crosswise straps, their heads swaying with the steadiness of creatures that knew the weight and the way. Behind them oxes strained into wooden yokes, their tongues moving lazily as if chewing the road itself, while wagons creaked and muttered over last night's ruts. A cartwheel clicked at a loose pin, each turn a small reminder, and a boy trotted alongside with a mallet and a wooden wedge tucked under his belt in case the noise became a fault. Men walked with staffs shod in iron, tapping ahead where the road turned to stones, and a woman in a blue hood kept tally on a wax tablet, her stylus leaving neat furrows. All of them, even the beasts, looked up when a rook called from a chestnut tree, as if some message were hidden in its harsh throat. Roads had memory. Some lay on the bones of older ways, polished by the sandals of long-dead feet and the iron of forgotten armies. Some were simply the space between ditches, widened by use and narrowed by growth. In low places the road sank to a slick, shining bed, and men shouldered planks to lay a makeshift causeway while the oxes huffed and stamped and rolled their eyes. On hills the road rose hard and clean, and wind combed the hedgerows so that leaves showed their paler undersides. All hillsides turned the color of pewter. At the foot of one rise a stone stood carved with a cross and a worn palm, where travelers pressed a hand for luck before the climb. The caravan paused there as they always did, not for luck alone but to gather breath, and then moved again, the line flexing like a living rope. Each bundle had its story. There were sacks of barley sealed with tarred string, rolls of undyed cloth smelling faintly of lanolin, jars of honey wrapped in straw and set in wicker to keep them from kissing each other to death. A chest banded with iron held knives and buckles cut by a town smith, the blades oiled and papered so they would not bite the wood that held them. 2 barrels marked with a chalked fish carried dried herring, coarse salt still crusted at the rings, and 1 careful cask rode covered with a hooded cloth, because it held a rarer spice, not more than a handful that a merchant would open only in a locked room. The weight of all these things pressed the caravan to the earth, and yet pulled it forward, because weight seeks balance and a fair price. The men spoke in a slow way, the strokes of their words like the strokes of a mill, useful, measured, a keeping of time. One told of a bridge that the winter had gnawed where the road crossed the flood meadow, and another named an inn where the ale was passable and the beds less so. A drover with a scar across his lip had a song about counting sheep against wolves, which he sang when the beasts began to fret, his voice steady as a rope thrown true. They talked of toll-keepers, of night watch, of a shrine where a silver blessing hung on a ribbon, paid for, it was said, by a trader whose cart had not slid into the ford when all thought it would. They did not speak much of fortune, for fortune does not come faster when called. By mid-morning they reached a stretch of paving laid in the time of stone-cut kings, broad and stubborn, the joints filled with moss like old stitches. Hooves sang on it, and wagon wheels clicked in a rhythm that made the younger beasts quicken their stride. To either side lay fields of rye bending like cat fur under a smoothing hand, and beyond, a wood where the trees leaned together, whispering with leaf and bark. A falcon turned above them and was gone, a small knife of motion in the high air. The road made the world orderly. To the left a ditch, to the right a ditch, and between them the strip of travel in which every desire must be carried. Before noon a small chapel on a low mound appeared, its stone chalk pale, a little bell hung from a wooden frame weathered to the color of ash. Travelers were tying ribbons there, red and white and faded gold, prayers in cloth for safe passage. The caravan halted, beasts lowered their heads, working the bits with patient tongues, while the folk went to kneel or stand as they were moved. A priest came out with hands dusty from sweeping, gave a short blessing that smelled of rushes and old smoke, and took a wedge of cheese as offering, which he carefully set aside in a cupboard. A candle guttered on the chapel's sill, its flame a small brave thing against the draught. After prayers they passed through a hamlet no larger than a handful of roofs. A woman with flour on her cheek leaned in a doorway, watching children ran along the verge until the bell mule snorted and they slowed, knowing not to startle burdened animals. In a yard a cooper tested a hoop with a tapping mallet, the note true. He glanced up and nodded once to the caravanners, workman to workman. Chickens scattered from the cart wheels like little bits of torn paper caught in a wind. The road lifted out of the hamlet without looking back, as roads do. Where a stream crossed the way, they found the ford shallow but stony, clear water showing the knuckled fists of rocks beneath. Men went ahead to probe with their staffs, marking the safe line by a willow pollard whose trunk was swollen like a knee. Oxes stepped with grave care, and the carts sat back on their axles, each spoke shouldering its part of the world while water Clyde then slipped away from the hub. A jar shifted in its padding, and the boy with the mallet caught it with both hands, holding his breath until the wheel found the far bank. When they stood on dry ground again, there was a small release of laughter that no one named. A little after noon they ate beneath an oak whose roots broke the earth into knuckled shapes, as if the tree were gripping the soil. They shared bread that had been baked days ago, softened in water, and cut apples into slices that turned brown at their edges as they watched. One man had a cloth packet of sage, and another a twist of salt. They passed them round, each portion no more and no less than any other. The beasts mouthed their fodder, seizing a mouthful, rolling it, letting fall the chaff. The woman with the wax tablet rubbed away the morning's marks and scored new lines for the afternoon, as neat as a seamstress. After the meal came the steepest hill of the day, blind near the crest where a hawthorn hedge grew thick and high. The drovers placed stones behind the wagon wheels, a stair for the carts to climb against, and the oxen leaned into their collars as if pushing the hill itself back into place. Men put shoulders to the wheels where the clay went slick, shoes slipping, hands flat on wood warm with sun. When they gained the top, the world opened like a chest lid to show a broader valley with fields squared by hedges and a line of trees guiding a river east. They stood a moment, catching the breath that hills take from men. Down on the other side, the road narrowed, hedges close enough to brush the packs with leaves and burrs, the scent of crushed nettle sharp and green. Here the caravan went single file, the bell a thread of sound through the hedge shadows, and everyone kept a closer eye. A hare burst from the verge like a thought you cannot catch, and a small flock of sheep looked on, chewing, as if they had always known that this line of strangers would pass. The woman in the blue hood walked beside the led horse now, one hand at its neck, and it lowered its head slightly under the touch. She mouthed a prayer she did not speak aloud. Along this pinch of road the danger was what deep forest, but human nearness, places where a man could wait behind a gate and pick his time. The drover with the scar carried his staff at a ready angle, and the boy went silent, his mallet suddenly heavy as a weight of fear. Yet there was only a gate, pattered with rain stains and scraped by years of swings, and a girl behind it feeding turnip greens to a tethered goat. The caravan passed under her steady gaze. She raised one hand and then lowered it, not sure whether farewell or greeting belonged to strangers. The breath that had been held returned to ordinary work. Toward late afternoon the road crossed a toll bridge. It was not a grand thing, just beams on cut stone piers with bracing like ribs and a narrow rail, but it had been dear to build and dear to keep. The tollman's hut leaned like a thoughtful man against the pier, and smoke rose from its thatch, blue and thin. He came out with a tally board and a face that knew the worth of patience. He counted beasts, wagons, and loads, and spat to one side when a cart tried to follow close, then smiled anyway and took his due in small coins as well as in a strip of dried eel. The bell sounded different on the bridge, as if the water swallowed some of its edge and gave it back rounded. Beyond the bridge stood an inn painted with a swinging board showing a fat stag that had never run in any real forest. The yard smelled of hay and horse dung and a decent stew, a smell that goes quickly to the heart of travelers. Men led beasts to the trough and wiped foam from bits with their thumbs. A girl brought a pail of water and balanced it easily with one hand while the other pushed loose hair from her brow. In the hall the benches were scarred and clean at once, and rushes mixed with mint underfoot to mask the day's spills. A host, narrow-eyed from years of listening, reckoned space for them in the stable and on the floor, and named his price as if telling the weather. They ate and drank, but even the comforts of an inn are part of the caravan's work. A man in a patched cloak asked questions with care, as if wrapping each in wool, the state of the northern gate, talk of brigands near the heather fields, whether the road beyond the ferry had held its shape through the last rains. In a corner, two chapmen traded news and a small bundle of pins, and the woman in the blue hood took out her tablet to update the reckonings, counting the toll and the bread and the ale. On the hearth a pot hung, where the stew had thickened into a thing both spoon and bread could lift, and someone poured a ladderful over yesterday's crust to make it almost new. The night gathered in the rafters, but sleep did not come yet. When they left the inn, lanterns swung like captured moons. The road had turned to darkness, crossed with paler lines of dust, and the hedges whispered in a language of small leaves and hunting things. They went only as far as a clearing used by many caravans, a place where the earth held a memory of fires and the ash lay thin even after rain. There they made their camp, lines staked for the beasts, guards set by turns, and the rest of them settling into their cloaks like birds into their own feathers. The stars glide slowly, no two nights the same, but all of them familiar. A watchman walked the ring with a staff to mark his going, tapping now and then to let the others know he was where he should be. From the dark came the thin noise of a fox, the soft motion of a badger somewhere in leaves, and the far-off bark of a dog in a farmstead that smelled the strangers without seeing them. The fire sank to a hush of coals and woke again when someone stirred it, sparks leaping up like brief messengers. The boy slept with the mallet under his arm, as if he would wake to fix whatever broke in the night. The woman slept with the wax tablet under her cloak, pressed flat as a heart. Morning began before the sun, with the creak of leather and the breath of beasts steaming white into the air. Someone's joints spoke louder than the harness, and someone else laughed quietly at it, kindness without words. Porridge thickened in a pot, while a thin sliver of cheese made its way down the line, and 2 apples became 8 pieces. The bell was still muffled in a rag to keep the camp quiet until they were ready. When it rang, it sounded like a beginning the road had been waiting for. They left the clearing as they had come to it, leaving behind only ash and flattened grass and a small lost button that would sink into the soil and forget the hand that lost it. Past a stand of eaches, they reached a sloping field where the road split into a higher path and a lower. The higher would keep boots dry, but asked for harder climbing. The lower ran near a marsh bright with yellow flags and the hum of hidden water. They chose the higher, not because they feared wet feet, but because a wheel sunk in marsh clay is a lesson that lasts many miles. On the rise, the wind came clean and brought the smell of far water, a river or perhaps the sea, and the beasts lifted their heads and tested it with their nostrils. The line flexed and flowed toward that scent as if pulled by thread. They met other travelers, as a river meets its tributaries. A monk with a burdened donkey, face windburned and eyes kind. He gave them the news of a broken bridge west and a generous granary east. A peddler with a box on his back and a smile that had sold more trinkets than his stock ever could. He swore by a saint they had never heard of, and bought a slice of bread with a coin that had seen many pockets. A small lord with 3 men-at-arms, horses bright and itching for speed, they passed with a clatter and the smell of oiled leather, leaving behind the slight unease of men who can take what they want. Every meeting taught the road anew. There came a day of rain. It began as a mist that smudged the edges of things, then thickened until drops struck the backs of the beasts like thrown peas. The road became striped with rivulets, and then simply became water holding the shape of the row within it. They tied oiled cloths over the most precious bundles, and shifted loads from a lame horse to a surer one, the animals patient beneath hands that knew where to touch. By evening, wet had made strangers of them all, and the fire they coaxed from stubborn wood felt like finding home in a hollow of the world. On a clearer day they entered a stretch of heaths where the sky seemed too large for the land it covered. Heather brushed the horses' legs, leaving scent on the leather, and small white stones lay about as if a giant had shaken salt from his hand. Here the danger was not men in hedges, but distance itself, and the long mind that comes with it, where one thought stretches thin and another takes its place like thread through a needle. Someone pointed out a standing stone with lichen like old coins on its face, and they left a sprig of heather in a crack as others had done. The bell sounded different here, each note blowing away before it could lie down. Midway through the heaths they found a wayside cross of weathered oak. Beneath it a small coffer had been set for alms to mend a bridge some towns away. The carving was rough but earnest, and the coffer's lid bore recent knife marks where someone had tested it. A man from the caravan placed a copper in the slot, and, after a thought, a second, because bridges were the kind of mercy that came back to you. They stood a moment in the cross's broken shadow, human figures shaped by greater wood, and then went on. The road does not stand still even when you do. Toward the end of their journey, the country gathered itself into signs of a larger town, more ditches, more hedges, more smoke, fields that belong to one hand set beside fields that belong to another. A flock of geese marched along a green lane as if they had a charter, and a mill turned its wheel like a housed river, steady and blind. At a turn they caught sight of the town walls, pale and high, and the gate like a mouth with iron teeth. A line of folk waited there their own small caravans of hopes and goods, and the keeper in his booth had ink on his fingers and sand in a dish to dry it. The bell fell silent for respect as they joined the line. At the gate they gave their names as they wished to be known, and their goods as they truly were, for falsehood here would cost dearer than any toll. A clerk scratched letters on a sheet that felt smooth and tight under his pen. He weighed the coin with a quick, practiced motion, eyeing its face for the small sins of clipping. The woman in the blue hood spoke with him as equals in a language of numbers and fairness, and the clerk looked at her twice, surprised, then only nodded, for the town liked men who could reckon and feared women who could do the same. The gate opened with a grunt and a sigh as if it disliked the work, and they stepped through into streets that gathered the world. The sound of many feet on boards and stone braided itself with their own. But this chapter is it a chronicle of stalls and booths beneath the banner of the town that will be told when we come to great fairs and counting tables. This is only the first measure, the setting of the key, the feel of the bow on the string. Caravans tie the far hill to the near, the small workshop to the wide need, the bell of the mule to the bell of the church, and both to the human hunger for exchange. They are patience given feet and purpose given weight, and if their stories move slowly, it is because slowness is how they do their work. Tonight they unharness within walls and sleep with a roof near at hand, and the road lies outside the gate like a faithful dog. In the morning they will count what arrived and what was lost. They will tell small lies about the hardness of the way and small truths about where to mend a strap. They will scrape mud from hooves and grease the axles and fold the oiled cloths, laying each in its place as if polishing memory. A few coins will change hands, and the chest will sound deeper for it. A few promises will be made for the next journey, and they will ring lighter than coin but bind just as well. And somewhere beyond the town, already a road rests and waits, knowing that weight and will are its old companions. Thus the caravan's day closes, leaving the taste of dust and bread and rain in the mouth, and the sense that the land itself has moved a finger's width nearer. Tomorrow will be the river's work, timber and grain floating where hooves cannot go, the barge pole's quiet push, the wharf at dawn, the water's monkish patience teaching trade a slower song. But that is another road, green and brown and silver under a different bell. Tonight the beasts breathe long and apt, and the last ember in the brazier winks like a small eye going to sleep. May the road remember their names when they set foot on it again, and may their names be light enough to carry, but heavy enough to matter. The caravan dreams, and somewhere the map of the world grows a new line by their passing. The river was older than the road, and it carried its weight with less complaint. Where wheels ground and hooves stumbled, the water moved steady and unbroken, make room for every burden that men set upon it. On its surface, barges lay long and low, their hulls blackened with pitch, timbers swollen with the memory of seasons spent afloat. A barge seemed clumsy on land but graceful on water, its wide belly made to drink in grain, timber, and stone. The morning mist rose from the stream like breath, wrapping each craft as if the river itself wished to keep them hidden from prying eyes. The bargeman knew every turn of the current as a shepherd knows his flock. One stood at the stern with a long pole, leaning it deep into the gravel bed, his shoulders rising and falling like the oars of a great unseen bird. Another walked the narrow gunwale, balancing with an ease that came only from years of practice, his eyes on the riverbank to read where the flow tugged hardest. Ropes stretched from prow to towpat, where horses plodded, pulling their charge against the sluggish weight of water. Harnesses creaked, hooves rang against stone set firm at the edge of the path, and the drivers called encouragement in low tones that blended with the lap of current. The cargoes varied with the season. In spring, barges brimmed with grain from lowland farms, the sacks tied and stacked until they formed pale walls under the stretched tarpaulins. In summer, timber rode in rough-hewn trunks, their bark still wet with resin, packed so tightly that the air was thick with the sharp scent of pine. Autumn saw barrels ale, cider, salted fish rolled into place, chocked with wedges so they would not tumble when the current played rough. Even stone traveled by water, millstones cut from quarries upriver, their faces smooth as moons, or blocks destined for the rising walls of a cathedral, carried like sleeping giants across the current. Men spoke little while afloat, for the river demanded attention. A rope that snagged on a submerged branch, a barge drifting into shallows where it would ground, even the sudden swell of water from a mill race, all could spell ruin for cargo and crew. Instead, they let their silence fill with sounds the river offered, the slap of waves against planking, the chuckle of current around a post, the call of birds in the reeds. Ducks rose at their passage, wings clapping water into spray. Errands lifted themselves with slow disdain, as if they judged the clumsy craft beneath them. At the wharves the world quickened. Children ran barefoot along the boards, eager to see what treasure the river had carried this tide. Merchants shouted to claim their bales and barrels, counting with one hand while scribbling with the other. Carts stood ready, waiting to carry goods inland, and porters bent their backs until sweat gleamed on their brows. Bargemen sat aside to drink ale that was watered but still welcome, their shirts loose about their shoulders, their hair plastered flat with spray. The air was thick with smells: tar, fish, damp wool, apples bruised in transit, and always the water itself, old and clean at once. The river did not only carry goods, it carried tidings. Letters folded and sealed in wax traveled faster on water than on any mule's back. Songs passed from town to town, changing like a river's course, yet always recognizably the same tune. A bargeman might bring word of a distant harvest, of a new toll levied by some lord river, of a mill collapsed in flood. In this way the river was not only a road but a tongue, speaking the news of the countryside to those who listened. Some stretches were perilous. In spring, when meltwater swelled the current, barges were driven hard against piers and banks, timbers groaning until seams gaped. In drought, the water shrank to ribbons, forcing men to lighten loads or drag their craft over shoals like beasts pulling a sled. Where the river widened, sudden winds could ruffle its skin and set barges drifting sideways, while in narrows the water's strength became a hand gripping the hull, shaking loose ropes and wedges. Bargemen cursed and prayed in the same breath, promising gifts at chapels if only their craft would pass unharmed. Along the banks, signs of this watery trade stood plain. Inns with painted boards promised lodging to crews who had pulled their barges for miles. Rope makers laid out coils in the sun, the smell of hemp thick as smoke. Smiths hammered out iron rings and nails to mend cleats and fastened planks. Even the churches marked the river's gift. Small shrines stood at ferries, candles guttering behind horn windows, each flame a thank offering for a safe crossing. Bargemen would bow their heads as they passed, too pressed for ties to stop, but unwilling to tempt fortune by ignoring such lights. When night fell on the water, the river's voice grew louder. Without the chatter of market or hammer, the lap and gurgle of current became a hymn. Barges tied at the bank rested like sleeping cattle, their ropes creaking softly, their hulls nudging against the shore. Crews lay on rough mats, their cloaks drawn close, dreaming of cargoes that would fetch a good price and of journeys yet to come. Sometimes lanterns bobbed on the current, carried by other craft moving after dark, their flames blurred by mist until they seemed like wandering stars. In the morning the river showed itself renewed, as though it had forgotten the burdens of the day before. Mist clung low, curling around reeds and willows, and barges slid out into the pale light with the patience of monks filing into choir. The first pole dug into gravel, the first rope strained against harness, and the journey began again, as it had yesterday and as it would tomorrow. For though the road might falter, the river always found its way, gathering streams into itself, gathering stories into itself, until at last it gave all ebb to the sea. The caravan had measured the land, the barge measured the water. Each served the hunger of towns and castles, each bore the weight of toil and hope, and yet the river's song was gentler, its patience deeper, as if it taught men that trade was not only the pressing of goods, but the passing of time. From grain to stone, from bale to barrel, the river remembered, carrying in its current the countless journeys of men who asked only that their burdens should float a little further. Before coin, before silk, before any cargo soft to the hand, there was the taste of salt, sharp as a bell on the tongue, bright as a struck flint in the mouth. Salt kept meat through winter and fish through the long road inland. It steadied butter, turned cabbage from leaf to store, and held hunger at bay when fields slept. A castle might glitter and a market might sing, but a village without salt went quiet by first frost. So roads formed where the taste was needed, and men and beasts wore them deeper each season, from shore to upland, from marsh to hall. At the sea's edge, where the tide laid its great breathing body across the flats, salters set out shallow pans rimmed with oaken boards. They shoveled sand, tamped clay, and drew channels with spades to conduct the brine, then waited for sun and wind to do the work no man could hurry. The day had its rituals, scraping the skin of salt that formed, raking crystals to the lip, lifting them in wooden scoops that dripped like pale rain. Tar smoke from boiling houses hung in thin clouds above the sheds, and the boards of the pans squealed softly as they settled with heat. Boots went white at the seams. Even the salter's eyebrows glittered. Further north and east lay other salt's homes, deep in the earth where brine seeped from rock, or under hills where men cut the white stone itself in chambers as tall as a nave. In brine towns, windlasses groaned, buckets rose, and the pumped water boiled in pans broad as rafted timber. Steam drifted from the boiling halls like prayers, and the water left its body behind in heaps of crystals that ran like sand when pushed. The furnacemen's faces shone and dried and shone again, and their shirts stiffened with salt as if they wore coats of frost in summer. They swore by saints no sailor knew, and measured tide by the tending of fire. From these places the salt roads began, donkeys with wicker panniers, mules with boxy chests, wagons lined inside with pitch so the precious grains would not be lost to cracks. The loads were bound and then bound again, for thieves liked what could be hidden in a sleeve or poured into a hand. Over the pans and out of the boiling towns, the lines climbed the first hills before dawn, a procession of whitened beasts moving like winter's shadow across a green land. Even the air behind them tasted of it. Tongues went dry, and the drovers drank more than they ate. Where authority was strong, a charter waited for salt, tallies notched, measures fixed, toll gates set like teeth at river crossings. A clerk would peer into a sack with a stick, measure by peck and bushel, and lay hands upon coin that took on a white bloom after such work. In places where authority grew thin, law broke into fragments like dried earth. Boys ran along the hedges with narrow faces and quick feet, and any driver who slept too heavy learned to wake with a lighter load. Salt had this power. It drew order and tempted disorder in equal measure. Inland, the hunger for salt swelled near curing houses and fish stalls. Rivers brought barges of herring and cod into the town, the fish stiff and shining, eyes turned to heaven to pack them for the year. The cooper's mallet rapped, and the salt rolled from cask to cask in a soft hiss like rain falling in straw. Men folded fish into beds of crystals, a saint's patience required for layer on layer, and stamped lids with marks that meant a price a month hence. Smoke from distant houses curled blue, but within the curing sheds the air stung with brine and fish oil, a taste that lived in beards until the next washing of the world. The road itself changed with the cargo. Where sacks of grain can spill and be swept, salt must not be wept into the ditch. A wagon tipped near a ford, and men became mad at once, clawing to save handfuls, licking their lips without knowing. In rain, the drovers covered panniers with oiled cloth, tying cords crosswise, and cursed the low clouds as if they were petty thieves. In drought, they worried less for the load and more for the beasts, whose tongues went white and cracked while they pulled their whitened burdens. Only the wind was friend to salt, drying and cooling and singing through the handles of the scoops stacked on the wagon's sides. Salt taught distances. There were 6 days from the marshes to the wool towns, 3 from the brine pans to the forest villages, a day and a half from the hill mine to the bishop's seat where kitchens worked behind blackened screens. In each place the price changed like weather, dear near the end of winter when vats were empty. kinder after a strong sun brought quick crusts to the pans. Children learned to taste the quality on their tongues, coarse and gray for the barrel, fine and bright for the table, a pinch as sharp as a slap to wake a pot grown dull. Bread and salt on a board made welcome in any house that had both. Some men built their fortunes on this pale harvest. They did not look like princes. Their boots showed salt scars, and their ledgers shone greasy with years of thumbed reckonings. They lent money in small measures to drovers for a beast, to salters for a new rake, to coprages for hoops, and took repayment in handfuls that became sacks, in sacks that became a room with a lock and a key. A merchant of salt would speak gently and move slowly, and at feast days his offering to the altar stood plain as winter, a barrel head full of the white thing itself, heavy as a coin chest. Stories gathered along the salt roads like straw caught in a hedge, of a wagon lost in a storm and found months later with the horses mummied by their own freight, of a thief who licked his fingers so often at the sack's mouth that his skin cracked, and he swore off theft and seasoning both, of a lord who taxed salt so cruelly that his people used ash for their food through Lent and would not sing at Easter. In other places, kinder tales, a salter's daughter whose dowry was a storehouse key, a boy who learned his letters, tracing them in spilt crystals on the counting table. Trade makes the things it moves, and it also makes the talk that moves with them. There were shrines along these paths, too, one to a saint who crossed the sea dry-shod, another to a bishop who blessed brine and calmed a storm, a third to no one in particular, or a wayside cross where drovers left a pinch in the dust for their dead. Churches kept salt as they kept anything holy, in a small horn jar near the font, to mix with water, to touch the tongue of a new Christian, to steady the world inside the walls as salt steadied food without. In hotter months, when the air in the nave grew still and thick with breath and beeswax, the clerk would set his jar near the window and tap it softly as if to wake it. Winter changed the road's manners. Ruts froze like carved lines and cracked under iron rims. Breath rose and hung, and the sacks chimed faintly where crystals rubbed one another like glass against glass. Snow made the world new and treacherous, hiding ditches, leveling hummocks. The drovers tied bells to their belts so the line would not lose itself within the white. Yet the cold lengthened the life of meat and fish and cheese. It honored the salt by sharing its work, and so the wheels turned on, slower, lower, but sure. Inns along the salt road kept extra straw then, for beasts that came in trembling and left with life restored. In mountain lands where salt was stone, the roads clung to ledges and crossed high saddles where the wind blew clean as a blade. Men cut blocks and lowered them on ropes, singing under their breath to keep the lowering steady, and goats watched from heights as if measuring the folly of men. Pack saddles took the weight better than wagons there, and the beasts learned the sound of sliding gravel and the smell of pine sap like a law. down in the valleys, children ran to meet the train, holding slivers of rock salt to their tongues and laughing at the sting. City gates counted salt with a sharper eye than other goods, not for its finery, for there was none, not for its beauty, which lay in use, but because every belly within the walls had a share in its fate. Bakers bought it by peck, picklers haggled over coarser grades, cooks for the great houses stood with arms folded and named prices that made merchants step back and then forward again. In the counting houses a clerk might weigh a coin twice and a sack thrice, and men would wait without complaint, knowing that fairness with salt kept peace better than guards at a door. If a sack split in the street, the sound was like dry rain. Men moved fast with scoops and boards, sweeping the crystals up before hoof and heel could grind them into dust. A boy who stood staring at the white hill would be cuffed lightly and sent to the pump with a bucket for the watering of brooms. When the cobbles were clean and the sack sewn anew, the merchant would cross himself, and sometimes the onlookers would as well, because it felt like a small mercy to have saved what fed not the mouth but the months. At feasts, salt had a seat of honor. The host set the psalter, a carved and lidded vessel, near the head of the board, and the place nearest it bore rank. Salt was pinched and passed, not poured, and one learned to season with care as one learned to speak with care among one's betters. Poorer tables set a rough bowl, and hands went in and pinches went out, and the talk was easy because the seasoning was shared. Bread and salt began treaties, ended quarrels, marked the welcome of a stranger whose name you asked only after he had tasted both. Yet as with any treasure, salt's blessing cast a shadow. A lord who held the marshes could squeeze the valleys, and a bishop with brine pans could make a market stand still until he named the price. Men who grew rich on ropes and rakes sometimes forgot the cold rooms they once kept, the hunger the white grain had kept away from their own families. In years when sun fled and rain ran like a mill stream, the salt harvest failed, and a whisper of fear went through the land more quickly than a messenger could ride. Then even generous men looked to their barrels with narrow hearts, and the roads went watched by too many eyes. Still, year upon year, the salt roads held. They shone faintly in moonlight where crystals had fallen and been picked and fallen again. They smelled of marsh wind or kiln smoke or pine, depending which way you faced. They taught a child how far a mouthful could travel and how many hands it would employ. They built the habit of keeping, which is a kind of wisdom, that food is it only for today, that labor has a long echo, that trade, done well, is the art of tie. A village that learned its salt, learned its seasons, and a town that counted it fairly, kept its bells from ringing for want. When the last wagon of the season left the coast, the pans rested like empty plates set out for guests who would not come until spring. In the brine towns the furnaces banked low, and the men worked at mending pans and planing boards, hands still tasting the grain of crystals when they licked a thumb to smooth a splinter. Inland, casks sat quiet in cool rooms, fish sleeping in their white beds, meat set aside against snow. And on the road itself, the deep wheel marks filled with frost and held dawn light like pewter, pointing toward markets where other treasures waited to be weighed. Soon cloth would take its turn, fleeces beaten clean, yarn stretched on the warp, bolts loaded and sent where hands could not spin fast enough to fill the need. But cloth, too, would ask for salt when sweat stained it and hands longed for bread. The roads would accept both burdens without favor, and the tongues of men would argue price while their bodies thanked the simple, stinging gift that kept hunger patient. So the salt roads fed all the others, not only with grain and fish and meat, but with the habit of weighing, the practice of fair measure, the knowledge that what is plain may be dearer than what dazzles. The sheep were the true merchants of Europe. Long before coins glittered in counting houses or ships brought silks to the quay, it was the fleece on their backs that turned fields into fortunes. Across downs and moors, meadows and commons, flocks moved like living clouds, white against the dark earth, grazing close to the soil with a patience that reshaped the land. Their bleating rose and fell with the wind, and the smell of lanolin clung to the shepherd's cloak, to his dog's fur, to every stone wall that passed. From this humble beginning, slow growing of wool, sprang the wealth of markets, guilds, and kings. In spring, shearing began. The village green became a place of quiet labor, sheep driven into pens, their hooves drumming like rain on packed earth. Shears clacked, metal teeth closing and opening, a rhythm broken only by a sheep's restless kick or a shepherd's soft murmur. The fleeces came off in great swaths, rolled and bundled before the animal knew its burden was gone. Children gathered the tufts that fell aside, stuffing them into sacks, while women sorted the wool by fineness, laying aside the softest locks for spinning thread fit for a lady's gown. The air smelled of sweat, straw, and the sharp, oily tang that marked true fleece. Once gathered, the wool began its long journey. First came the washing in streams or tubs, where dirt and grease were pressed out by trampling feet. The water turned clouded and brown, a ghost of all the seasons the sheep had walked under rain and sun. Spread on hedges or racks, the wool dried in the wind, lightened by the air's cleansing hand. Then came the carding, teeth of wood drawing fibers into alignment, soft heaps turning into nests that begged to be spun. It was work that filled evenings, a task for many hands while stories were told and firelight flickered against walls. Spinners set their distaffs and dropped their spindles, drawing fibers into a line as thin as breath. The hum of the spindle's whir grew as familiar as birdsong, and the thread coiled itself into skeins, strong and fine enough to hold the weight of cloth, yet tender in the hand. Women spun most of it, though in towns whole streets of houses joined in, each family responsible for a portion of yarn, the labor binding them as tightly as the twist itself. Spinning was the quiet heart of cloth-making, the thread before the pattern, the whisper before the word. Weaving gave body to what had been only promise. Looms rose like wooden gates, their beams worn smooth by generations of use. Threads stretched taut across the frame, a forest of lines waiting for the shuttle's flight. Back and forth it flew, bearing weft through warp, each pass a footstep toward cloth. The beater came down, steady as a hammer, pressing threads close until the fabric thickened and grew. In cottages the looms creaked and sang. In larger halls they thundered, rows of them working at once, a sound that filled the street like the roar of a tide. Dyers gave color to the woven world. From woad they coaxed blue, deep as twilight on stone. From madder, a red that glowed like embers. From weld, a yellow bright as new straw in sunlight. The vats smoked, and the dyer's hands bore stains that no washing could erase, living proofs of their craft. Cloth hung on lines above the river, bright banners that turned heads and made mouths water for a bolt or two. Even simple grey wool, once dipped and dried, became something a merchant could fold and display with pride, measuring out his wealth a yard at a tithe. Markets swelled with wool and cloth. Bales rose like miniature towers, cords tightening them into cubes that smelled of lanolin and dye. Merchants pressed fingers into the folds, testing the density, weighing worth by touch. In the wool towns, especially across England and Flanders, fortunes shifted on the strength of a fleece. Guild halls kept tall windows to catch the light on their wares, and scribes bent over ledgers that marked every sack, every coin, every promise of payment. The language of cloth became the language of wealth, as binding as any knight's oath or bishop's seal. Shepherds, though, saw little of that wealth. They lived on hillsides with their dogs and staffs, patched cloaks their only protection against wind and sleet. They knew each ewe by sight, each lamb by voice, and they watched the sky more closely than the market. Yet without their tending, the looms would have stilled and the guild halls fallen quiet. Their labor was a thread in the great weave, unseen but essential, as the warp is hidden beneath the weft. They sold their fleeces at fairs and took home salt, iron tools, or bread, never imagining that their wool would sail across seas or hang in a prince's chamber. Cloth was more than clothing, it was currency. Rolls of wool changed hands in payment for debts, in dowries, in offerings to monasteries. Taxes were levied in bales, wars funded by fleece. In times of scarcity, men bartered cloth for grain. In times of plenty, they hoarded it as safely as coin. The king himself drew profit from it, for wool taxes filled treasuries and paid for castles stone. It was said that a monarch might build a tower from nothing but the fleece that crossed his borders each year. And in truth, the power of wool often outlasted the power of swords. Legends clung to the trade of shepherd boys who dreamed of cities made of cloth, of weavers whose tapestries showed scenes so lifelike that birds pecked at the fruit woven into them, of dyers who claimed to have found a color that never faded, though none could prove it. In monasteries, scribes clothed holy books in woolen bindings dyed rich red or green, and abbots thanked God for sheep as much as for saints. Cloth carried not only warmth but also story, each pattern a memory, each color a symbol. A cloak told who you were before you spoke a word. When winter pressed, wool was the wall against hunger. Blankets spread across straw beds, cloaks pulled close around shoulders, hoods drawn tight against the wind. Cloth muffled babies' cries, cushioned weary heads, wrapped the dead for burial. It was at once ordinary and sacred, woven into every stage of life. And in spring, when sheep stood again in their pens, fleeces thick and ready for shears, the circle began anew, a rhythm as steady as breath. Thus wool and cloth were merely trade, but the very weave of medieval life. From hillside to hall, from spindle to loom, from market to monastery, they bound together the lives of shepherd, spinner, dyer, and merchant. Rich and poor alike felt their touch, and in every fold lay the labor of countless hands. The world might glitter with silver or smell of spice, but it was wool that wrapped its shoulders and warmed its sleep. The road grew richer as it stretched farther. Grain, wool, timber, and stone fed the bellies and clothed the backs of common folk. Yet there were other goods that whispered of distant horizons and rarer dreams. When the lids of chests were lifted in market halls and the scents of cinnamon, pepper, and clove drifted into the air, men turned their heads as if caught by a hymn. When bolts of silk were unrolled, soft as breath and lustrous as moonlight, the crowd pressed nearer, fingers reaching for what seemed scarcely of this earth. These treasures traveled far, across deserts, over mountains, through cities none in the market had seen, and they bore with them not only flavor and finery, but the weight of wonder itself. Spices were the first to tempt the senses. Pepper, black and round as seeds of night, clattered from sacks into scoops of brass. Cinnamon bark, curled into fragrant scrolls, gave off a sweetness that clung to every hand that touched it. Cloves pricked fingers with their stiff buds, yet their aroma softened meat and sweetened ale. Nutmeg and mace, rarest of all, seemed more jewel than spice, worth their weight in coin. In kitchens, a single pinch could mask the taste of age in meat, or turn an ordinary pottage into a dish fit for a feast. To a peasant, they were a dream. To a merchant, they were fortune. The journey of these spices was long and perilous. From islands where nutmeg trees grew in secret groves, from coasts where cinnamon was cut and dried, they passed into the hands of Arab traders, then into caravans that crossed endless deserts, camels padding soft across sand as the sun bled its fire into the earth. Cities along the way grew fat on the trade, their gates thronged with bales and casks, their markets full of tongues from half the world. By the time the spices reached Europe, their cost was tenfold what it had been at the source, each handful a tale of oceans and sands, tolls and taxes, risk and luck. Silk was rarer still, born in the secret labor of worms hidden in mulberry groves of the East. The thread was finer than any spinner's flax, stronger than any wool, yet softer than water slipping through the hand. Caravans bore bolts of silk westward, each wrapped in waxed cloth, guarded as if it were gold. In Constantinople, markets glittered with the sheen of it, hues shifting like dawn across the sky. From there it found its way north and west into the coffers of kings and the treasure chests of great abbeys. A single garment of silk could mark its wearer as chosen, set apart from the world of wool and linen. In towns, merchants displayed spices and silks as carefully as relics. They unlocked chests with solemnity, lifted lids slowly, let scents drift outward to announce what lay within. Bolts of silk were unfurled across tables so that light could play upon them, shimmering in ripples like a quiet pond stirred by wind. Buyers leaned close, eyes wide, lips parted. They tasted a grain of pepper, held a thread of silk against the skin, weighed the worth of such luxuries against the hunger of their purse. Even those who did not buy went home remembering the scent, the gleam, the promise of another life glimpsed for a moment. The church, too, felt the pull of these treasures. Spices seasoned the feasts of feast days, perfumed incense in censers, preserved the bodies of saints with sweetness against decay. Silk clothed altars and swathed reliquaries, its sheen turned toward heaven. Bishops wore stoles and copes lined with it, the threads of far-off worms woven into the garments of worship. For many, silk and spice seemed less of earth and more of heaven, tokens that the world was wide and that God's creation held wonders yet unseen. Yet along with wonder came suspicion. Tales grew of merchants who lied about their wares, passing off dyed flax as silk, selling sawdust steeped in scent as cinnamon. Priests thundered against vanity, warning that silks would tempt the soul and spices would inflame the body. Still the trade continued, for temptation and desire are older than sermons, and the taste of pepper on the tongue or silk against the skin was stronger than fear. Legends followed these goods. It was said that cinnamon was guarded by giant birds who nested in high cliffs, their nests made from sticks of spice that men risked their lives to steal. Pepper, some claimed, grew in forests where serpents guarded the vines, so the fruit was burned to drive them off, blackening it into its familiar form. Silk was believed to be combed from the leaves of trees by distant peoples, its origins a secret closely guarded. These tales spread from mouth to mouth, lending the goods an air of enchantment that only deepened their allure. Not only nobles and bishops sought them, apothecaries kept small drawers of spice to mix into remedies, believing pepper could drive out fever and cinnamon strengthen the heart. Wealthy merchants set silken hangings in their halls to catch the light of candles, their wives wearing gowns embroidered with threads that shone like rivers in moonlight. Even the humblest household might, once in a generation, taste a pinch of spice at a wedding feast, or glimpse a bolt of silk borne past in procession. Such moments were enough to fill stories told long after. Ships carried these wonders into Europe's harbors, their holds heavy with barrels and chests, their decks alive with shouting sailors and wary guards. Dockside crowds gathered at their arrival, eyes wide at the smells spilling into the air, sharp, sweet, intoxicating. A sailor might pocket a few peppercorns, his wages richer for the taste alone. A merchant might stand with arms folded, calculating profit before the cargo was even weighed. The river of trade, carrying salt and wool and grain, grew deeper and swifter when spice and silk poured into its course. Yet spice and silk were what merely riches, they were windows. Each handful of clove, each bolt of shimmering cloth spoke of lands beyond imagining, of deserts that swallowed men whole, of seas that bore storms like living things, of cities where towers gleamed with tile and domes rose like suns. To those who touched and tasted them, the world seemed wider, and the thought of distant places grew sharper, closer. A man chewing pepper might dream of caravans. A woman touching silk might picture groves of trees hung with shimmering threads. Wonder traveled as surely as the goods themselves. So spice and silk wove themselves into the fabric of medieval life, not daily, not common, but as bright threads that reminded all who saw them that the world was vast, and that trade was more than barter. It was a promise that in the most ordinary village was linked by road and river, by caravan and ship, to horizons far away. And though bread and wool might sustain, spice and silk taught the tongue and the eye to hunger for beauty. Within the narrow lanes of a prosperous town, behind walls half timbered and half stone, stood the house of a merchant. Its gables thrust forward like proud brows, and its windows, small, horn-paned, latticed with lead, glimmered with candlelight at dusk. A painted sign hung above the door, marking the trade within. A sheaf for grain, a fleece for wool, a small coffer for general goods. To passers-by it was only another house, yet within lay the hum of a different life, measured not by the tolling of church bells alone, but by ledgers, tallies, and the slow tide of goods moving in and out. The merchant's hall was at once home and counting place. A long table stretched down the room, its boards scarred by years of weights and seals pressed upon them. Chests lined the walls, their iron bands dark with age, each locked and sealed with a mark known only to the household. On shelves above the hearth sat scales, small and large, their pans shining dully where brass had been rubbed smooth by coin and measure. Here, in the heart of the house, trade and family met. Children learned to trace letters on wax tablets, while clerks copied tallies into books, and wives oversaw both kitchen and accounts with equal authority. The merchant himself moved between worlds. In the morning he might stand at the wharf, shouting orders to unload bales of wool or casks of wine. By afternoon he sat at the table with a clerk, weighing coin, noting debts owed and debts due. At night he joined his family at the hearth, eating bread and broth while discussing not only the day's trade but the condition of roads, the news from distant fairs, the safety of sea routes. His speech was measured, his hands quick and sure, his gaze weighing more than coin alone. He was not noble, yet neither was he bound to earth like a peasant. His power lay in movement, in exchange, in the unseen threads that tied distant markets together. Above the hall lay storerooms. Here bales of cloth rested beneath tops. Casks of spice exhaled their faint perfume, and iron tools clinked faintly in wooden bins. The air carried the mingled scent of wool, leather, and tar, so strong that a visitor could guess the merchant's wealth with eyes closed. Locks barred the doors, but trust was as much a guard as iron. For clerks and servants who proved false did not remain long in a house where reputation was treasure. Children played among the chests, imagining themselves princes counting ransom or sailors unloading wonders, though their mother scolded them away with a firm hand. The family chamber was plain compared to the storerooms, wooden beds with straw mattresses, coverlets of wool dyed in cheerful colors, a crucifix above the door, a chest at the foot of each bed for clothing. Here the world narrowed again, to love, quarrel, prayer, and sleep. Yet even here trade pressed close, a gown of foreign cloth, a candle that burned longer for being made of beeswax bought dear, a small silver cup from a distant fair. The merchant's children grew up with these tokens about them, reminders that the world was wide and that their place in it was not fixed but shifting, as fortunes shifted with trade. Meals in the merchant's house told their own story. Bread stood always at the table, but the kind of bread white, brown, or coarse spoke of prosperity. Meat appeared more often than in a peasant's cottage, spiced on feast days with pepper or cinnamon. Fish arrived fresh from the river, or salted from a barrel brought upriver, laid upon boards polished by years of use. Ale flowed freely, though the merchant might water it at noon to keep minds clear for reckoning. At feast times neighbors gathered, tables lengthened with boards laid on trestles, and stories flowed with the wine. The wealth of trade was shared in part, not hoarded, for a merchant knew that a reputation for generosity was worth as much as a chest of coin. In the upper chamber, the merchant kept his ledgers. Bound in leather, their pages filled with lines of neat script, they marked every sack, every cask, every promise made. Beside them lay bags of coin, silver pennies, groats, florins stamped with the heads of distant princes. Weights sat ready for testing, a balance for checking, a box of seals and stamps for binding agreements. When the merchant bent over these, candlelight reflected in his eyes, and the room seemed half study, half chapel, a place where faith was set upon paper, where numbers became prayers for future gain. Not all was wealth and comfort. Risk lived in the merchant's house as a constant guest. A ship might founder at sea, and a cargo vanish with it. A fare might fail, leaving chests unsold. A debtor might default, leaving blank lines in the ledger where coin was expected. Even fire and sickness threatened, for a storeroom of wool could burn, and a fever could silence the hand that knew the reckonings best. So the merchant lived between hope and caution, his fortune never fully his until it was spent or turned into land or stone. Still, there was pride in such a house. Pride in the carved beam above the door, in the tapestries, perhaps coarse compared to noble ones, but bright and telling stories of saints or heroes, in the smell of bread baking in the morning, in the sound of the merchant's own bell when goods were weighed. Pride, too, in the family standing, for their name carried weight in the Guildhall, their voices heard in decisions that shaped markets and trade routes. A merchant's house was not a castle, but it was a fortress of another kind, guarded by trust, bound by reckoning, filled with goods that tied the family to distant places. Children raised here carried trade in their blood. Sons might follow their father into counting and bargaining, or were sent to study letters in a monastery school so they could reckon more keenly. Daughters might bring bolts of cloth or sacks of coin as dowry, binding two merchant houses together in stronger alliance than a wall. In every case, the merchant's house was a place of beginnings, where the road from distant caravans ended and the future of trade set out anew. Thus the merchant's house was both ordinary and extraordinary. Its walls sheltered laughter, quarrels, prayers, and sleep like any home. Yet within those same walls lay chests of coin, bales of cloth, casks of spice, ledgers of reckoning, all the gathered strength of distant roads and rivers. To pass its threshold was to step into a place where the world outside pressed close, where the lives of shepherds, sailors, dyers, and drovers were bound together by ink and weight. A merchant's house was a mirror of trade itself, humble in parts, rich in others, always shifting, always full of promise. The fair began before dawn, with smoke rising like banners over meadows trampled flat by cartwheels. A hush lingered in the air, the moment before the hive awakens, when beasts stamped and drivers muttered, when merchants laid out their wares under canvas that flapped in the breeze. Then, with the ringing of a bell or the cry of a herald, the meadow became a town of its own, sprung up overnight and alive with voices. Bright cloths stretched across stalls, barrels stood on end, scales gleamed in the first light of day, and the smell of food drifted over it all, roasting meat, spiced wine, new bread. The great fair had opened, and the world seemed to walk through its gates. People came from every direction. Villagers brought their cheeses wrapped in cloth, their eggs cushioned in straw, their baskets of onions and garlic. Shepherds drove sheep into pens hastily fenced with hurdles, while drovers tugged at halters of cattle, their hooves sending out dust. Merchants from far towns rolled in barrels of ale or bolts of cloth, their apprentices sweating as they hauled goods into neat display. And beyond them, from distant lands, came traders with spices, silks, furs, and metals. Foreign tongues on their lips, foreign coins in their pouches, foreign tales in their mouths. At a great fair, the horizon itself seemed to widen. The layout was more than chance. Stalls were set by guild so that wool sellers kept together, dyers formed a row, and metal workers clanged and hammered side by side. Along one lane, scribes offered letters and contracts, dipping pens into inkpots and pressing seals into wax. Along another, cooks tended spits and cauldrons, the air rich with fat and smoke. The money changers held their tables near the gates, weighing coins from every corner, testing silver with knives, and shaking their heads at clipped or false pieces. At the center rose the fair's hall, where great merchants met behind closed doors, striking bargains that shaped trade far beyond the meadow. Noise built until it became its own music. Criers called prices, haggling voices rose and fell, beasts lowed from their pens, hammers rang, and fiddles scraped as minstrels set their cases open for coin. Children darted between legs, chasing each other, their laughter mixing with the shouts. Monks wandered through with baskets of relics or indulgences, their chants half drowned by the din. Jugglers tossed knives that flashed in the sun, while acrobats turned somersaults to delight those who could not afford a bolt of cloth, but could spare a penny for a trick. The fair was business, but it was also festival, a tie when labor and joy walked hand in hand. Money changed hands as fast as words. A sack of wool became a pile of coins. Those coins, in turn, became a chest of salt or a barrel of wine. Promises were inked in contracts, debts settled, futures pledged. Men weighed their purses and found them heavy in the morning, lighter by noon, and hoped to fill them again before dusk. Women bargained fiercely for cloth to line gowns, for needles to mend, for trinkets that pleased the eye. Children begged for honey cakes or ribbons, and merchants smiled to see coins pass into their hands, small streams feeding the great river of trade. The fair had its dangers too. Thieves prowled, their fingers quick among crowds, and guards kept sharp eyes on pouches and chests. Disputes flared, voices hot over measures and weights, hands reaching for knives until wardens stepped between. Fires sometimes leapt from cooking stalls, spreading fast through canvas roofs, and then men rushed with buckets, shouting, while merchants prayed aloud for their goods. Yet for all its risks, the fair endured, for its wealth was too great to ignore. Lords took tolls at the gates, towns claimed taxes, bishops claimed offerings, and the fair fed them all. As evening came, torches were lit, their flames dancing above the press of bodies. Stalls closed one by one, goods locked away in chests or driven into pens for the night. But taverns filled, benches crowded with tired merchants and drovers drinking ale and recounting the day's bargains. Songs rose, coarse and merry, and dice clicked across tables until a sharp eye or sharper word ended the game. In the glow of torch and hearth, men and women who had haggled fiercely by day sat shoulder to shoulder, bound by the common weariness of trade. The fair slept only lightly, for dawn would waken it again. Great fairs shaped more than the meadow they filled. They tied villages to towns, towns to cities, cities to distant lands. A fleece sheared in spring might, through the fair, become cloth for a noble's gown by winter. A spice packed in a distant desert might pass through 10 hands before its scent filled a kitchen at a feast. Even coins, clipped and worn, bore the memory of journeys across a continent. Each fair was a knot in the vast net of exchange, holding together the far edges of a world that otherwise might have drifted apart. Stories lingered long after the tents were struck. A child's memory of a juggler's flame, a farmer's tale of his first coin earned beyond his own village, a merchant's pride in a bargain struck well. These became part of the season's reckoning, told at hearths and in guild halls until the next fair called them forth again. And so the fairs lived, not only in their days of bust, but in the echoes they left behind, in the dreams of those who counted time by their return. Thus the great markets stood as bridges between ordinary life and the wide world. They were places where hunger met supply, where want met abundance, where wonder met coin. They were as old as trade itself and as fresh as the laughter of a child chasing a ribbon through the dust. And when the last torch burned low and the meadow returned to silence, the fair's work was not done, for the goods and stories it carried would ripple outward, shaping lives far from the trampled grass where it had stood. In every town where trade grew thick, men bound themselves into guilds. They were not born from parchment alone, but from the need for fellowship, protection, and fairness. A merchant alone was a man adrift. A guild was the ship that bore him. Behind carved doors and under painted signs, these brotherhoods gathered, their halls smelling of oak beams, wax candles, ink, and the faint spice of feasts past. They pledged to uphold measures, to guard against fraud, to support a brother in hardship, and to honor the saints whose images watched from painted walls. The guild was at once a shield and a family, as necessary as bread to those who carried goods. The hall itself was a place of wait. Long benches lined the chamber, scarred by elbows and knives, their wood darkened by years of oaths. A table stood at the far end, where the masters sat, their seals resting on cords, their eyes sharp with the habit of judgment. Above them hung the guild's banner, cloth dyed in bold colors, bearing the tools of their trade, scales, keys, bales, or the holy symbols of their patron saint. When meetings began, candles flickered against painted saints, and the air grew heavy with the sound of many voices becoming one. Joining the guild was no simple matter. A man might serve for years as apprentice, then as journeyman, proving his skill not only in bargaining but in honesty, in keeping weights true and promises firm. At last he would bring his petition, offering coin and a feast for his fellows. He would swear oaths with hand on relics, and the hall would echo with assent. From that day he was bound not only to his own fortune, but to the guild's. If he prospered, they prospered. If he faltered, their hand was under him. Guilds set the rules of trade. They fixed measures so that a pound in one stall weighed the same as a pound in another. They judged disputes when buyers and sellers quarreled, their word holding more power than a sheriff's in some towns. They set tolls for members and fined those who broke their statutes. By their watch, false weights were cast into the river, Dishonest traders barred from the fair, for though coin was king, trust was its throne, and the guild kept it polished. Yet guilds were what only stern keepers of law, they were keepers of charity. When a member fell ill, the guild paid for his care. When he died, they buried him with prayers and bells, his family not left to hunger. Widows received alms, orphans found places in apprenticeships, and the poor of the town received bread at feast days from the guild stores. Their accounts carried not only debts and credits, but gifts, for they knew that reputation in heaven mattered as much as reputation in the market. The guild feast was its heart. On the day of their patron saint, the members gathered in the hall, long tables heavy with bread, meat, and ale. Candles burned in great sconces, and minstrels played in the gallery above. Masters sat at the high table, but every member had a place, from the newest to the oldest. Prayers rose before eating, blessings for the saint who watched over their trade, and then the noise of knives and voices filled the air. Pledges were renewed with drink, disputes were softened by laughter, and the hall rang with songs that spoke of labor and fellowship. For one night, wealth and worry were set aside, and the guild remembered itself as family. Symbols marked their belonging. Some wore small badges, silver keys, or gilded scales pinned to their cloaks. Others carried seals pressed into wax, binding contracts with the guild's authority. In processions through the town, they carried banners high, colors bright against the gray of stone walls. At funerals they walked together, torches in hand, their steps slow and solemn. To see them was to see strength woven into many strands, not a single cord but a rope braided against the weight of the world. Not all loved the guilds. Outsiders grumbled that they guarded trade too jealously, keeping prices high and shutting out strangers. Some lords resented their power, for a guild's word could sway a town as surely as a decree. Yet no town could thrive without them. They kept order where the law was thin. They lent money where banks did not yet reach. They brought stability where chance might otherwise have ruled. Their faults were many, but so were their virtues, and the balance was judged fair by those whose lives depended on honest measure. Within their halls, tales grew of a master who gave bread to every beggar on the saint's day, and found his coffers fuller the year after, of a brother who cheated and was cast out, his stall burned to the ground in shame, of a widow whose son rose through the guild and became master himself, carrying her to the hall in pride. These stories became lessons repeated to apprentices by the fire, to remind them that trade was not only profit but honor, not only goods but the keeping of one's word. As the fair tied town to countryside, so the guild tied man to man. Each oath, each measure, each feast was a thread, weaving a fabric strong enough to bear the weight of markets, of wealth, of risk. Without them, trade would have been a scattered thing, fragile as unspun wool. With them it became cloth, dyed bright, stretched firm, and cut to fit the lives of many. So the guilds of trade stood, half earthly, half holy pillars of the marketplace. They were stern and they were generous, proud and humble, flawed and faithful. They were the hands that held the scales steady, the voices that kept quarrels from turning to blows, the banners that reminded all who saw them that fellowship was stronger than solitude. And when the hall grew quiet at night, with candles guttering low and ledgers closed, the guild's strength remained in the memory of voices raised together, swearing to keep measure true. Before a bargain was sealed, before a load was claimed or a cargo released, there came the weighing of coin. In every market, in every hall, the clink of silver was the heartbeat of trade. Purses hung heavy from belts, their leather polished dark by years of touch, the cords tied fast with knots a thief might envy. When a merchant sat to reckon, he drew out not only coin but the small tools of trust, scales, weights, knives, and books. The counting of money was more than arithmetic. It was a ritual, a dance of fairness and suspicion, faith and doubt, that bound the world together as surely as wool or salt. Coins themselves were travelers. Some bore the face of the local king, his crown hammered in bold strokes, his name circling the edge like a prayer. Others came from far cities, stamped with strange symbols, their letters curling like vines, their silver of a different shade. They bore the marks of wear, clipped edges from dishonest hands, holes where a nail had tested them, dark stains where years of palms had pressed their warmth. To a trained eye, each coin carried a history, minted in one place, carried through another, weighed and measured at every stop, bearing the memory of markets long past. The scales were the true judges, hung on cords, balanced on beams, they stood at the heart of every transaction. A merchant placed a coin on one pan and a weight on the other, his eyes narrowing as the beam tilted and came level. Weights were made of brass or stone, some marked with official stamps, others worn smooth with use. Honest scales were praised, false ones cursed, and the punishment for deceit could be harsh: confiscation, expulsion from the guild, even public shame. For without fair measure, the whole house of trade crumbled. Counting tables were simple but sacred. Boards laid flat, marked with lines to keep coins in rows, their surface polished by decades of use. Merchants spread their money across these boards, sorting by type, by size, by worth. They slid coins with the edge of a hand, set them in neat stacks, tapped them to hear the ring of true silver. Apprentices watched closely, learning the small movements, flick of a thumb to test weight, the tilt of a head to catch gleam in the light. Every gesture mattered, for error was costly and carelessness shameful. Money changers were the interpreters of this world. They sat at tables near gates and fairs, ready to turn one lord's coin into another's, to weigh foreign silver and judge its trustworthiness. Their hands were quick, their eyes sharper than knives. They knew which mints were true, which were debased, which cities had issued new currency, and which kings had died, leaving old coin uncertain. Their profit lay in small differences, fee for exchange, the margin between one weight and another, but their power was vast. Without them, merchants could cut trade beyond their own town. Yet coin was never only silver, it was promise. Behind each piece lay the weight of trust that a sack of wool was worth so many groats, that a barrel of fish could be ransomed with pennies, that a chest of spices might command a prince's ransom. In truth, the silver itself was less than the faith men placed in it. When trust failed, when a king debased his coin, or a counterfeiter spread false pieces, trade faltered like a cart with a broken wheel. But when trust held, the smallest coin could turn wheels across continents. Some merchants kept tallies in books, others on wax tablets, scratching lines and figures to mark debts and payments. Contracts were sealed with wax, pressed with signet rings that bore the mark of families or guilds. Promises were written down, witnessed, stored in chests for years. A sack of coin might change hands once, twice, 10 times, but the ink in the book kept the memory, binding men to their word long after the silver itself had vanished into other purses. In this way, counting grew into a kind of scripture, shaping trust with lines of ink as surely as priests shaped it with lines of prayer. At home, the merchant stored his coin with care. Some hid it in chests bound with iron, their lids fastened with locks and seals. Others buried hoards beneath hearthstones or in fields, trusting earth more than men. Still others loaned their silver, making profit on the promise that it would return heavier than before. Every choice carried risk, fire, theft, betrayal, misfortune. And so seem as they counted, merchants prayed, for coin was a fragile guardian, loyal only while trust endured. In great towns, mints rang with the hammering of new coin. Blanks of silver were struck between dies, the king's face impressed with each blow, the clang echoing like bells. Apprentices gathered the fresh coins, warm from the hammer, and stacked them in piles that gleamed like water under moonlight. Officials weighed and tallied them, stamping their worth into parchment. From here the coins spread like seed, carried in purses, sewn into garments, hidden in boots, trickling into every market until they lost their shine and became common once more. Legends surrounded money as they did every treasure. Stories told of dragons guarding hoards of gold, of kings ransomed with sacks of silver, of saints who turned copper into bread for the poor. Mothers told their children to beware of greed, that coin could burn a hole in the heart as quickly as in a purse. Priests reminded merchants that silver could not buy salvation, though alms might ease the way. Yet still men counted, still women measured dowries by coin, still the clink of money was a sound more persuasive than sermons. So coins and counting formed the marrow of trade. They were small things, each piece no larger than a man's thumb, yet they carried the weight of empires. A coin was trust, memory, and hope made metal. Counting was its liturgy, scales its altar, ledgers its scripture, and as long as men believed in their worth, the roads and rivers would stay full, the markets would stay loud, and the world would keep turning to the sound of silver. The river brought goods inland, but it was the sea that opened the world. Harbors lay like mouths along the coast, breathing in ships from distant lands, breathing out their own to risk the waves. Masts rose above town walls like forests of wood stripped bare, their rigging humming in the wind, their sails patched and stained with journeys past. The smell of tar, salt, and fish clung to the air so strongly that even the cobbles seemed to taste of it. To live by the sea was to live with the knowledge that fortune and ruin alike might come riding on a tide. The ships themselves bore many shapes. Cogs with their broad bellies and single square sail carried wool and grain in holds dark as caves, barrels stacked tight from keel to deck. Caravels, slimmer and swifter, danced more lightly upon the waves, their triangular sails drinking the wind with eagerness. Hulks lumbered like oxus, slow but steady, their timbers thick enough to withstand storms. From small fishing boats to merchant carracks, each craft had its own song of ropes, its own smell of pitch, its own crew hardened by brine. Together they made the sea into a road as well traveled as any highway of stone. Loading a ship was a ritual of order and sweat. Casks rolled down gangplanks, thudding into the darkness of the hold, where men wedged them into place with beams and wedges. Bales of wool were lowered on ropes, swinging gently before settling into heaps that smelled of lanolin and dye. Iron bars clanged as they were stacked, the sound echoing through the timbers. Above, clerks checked tallies, calling out numbers over the creak of planks and the grunt of men. The harbor rang with shouts in many tongues, a chorus of trade that blurred the line between work and worship. Sailing meant surrendering to the sea's will. Once the ropes were loosed and the sail unfurled, the land shrank behind like a memory. The wind filled the cloth with a snap. The hull leaned into the water, and the ship became a creature alive, groaning, straining, surge forward. Crews moved like dancers, hauling ropes, setting yards, shouting orders that vanished into the roar of waves. Days passed with nothing but horizon, water below and sky above, the sun measuring tie and the stars keeping watch. Men learned to live with the roll of the deck, to sleep in hammocks that swayed like cradles, to eat salted meat and hard biscuit softened with ale. The sea gave and took in equal measure. Some voyages ended with safe arrival, holds full, purses heavy, prayers answered. Others ended with wrecks scattered along rocky coasts, timbers splintered, goods swallowed by waves. Storms rose without warning, winds shrieking like demons, rain slashing so hard it stung through woollen cloaks. Lightning lit the ocean as if revealing the bones of giants, and men prayed louder than the wind, promising alms and vows if only the sea would release them. Pirates, too, lurked in hidden bays, sails blackened with soot, ready to chase and board, knives flashing in the salt spray. Every voyage was a wager, the sea's dice rolling unseen. Yet the promise outweighed the peril. From the Baltic came furs, wax, timber, and fish, carried south to warmer lands. From the Mediterranean came oil, wine, fruit, and silk, borne north to colder tables. The English Channel teemed with ships bearing wool, their sails crowded like banners in battle. The Hanseatic League sent fleets from port to port, their merchants as disciplined as soldiers, their convoys guarded by law and custom. Each route became a thread, and together they wove a web across the sea, binding lands that would otherwise have remained strangers. Harbors mirrored this wealth. Quays stretched long, crowded with cranes and capstans. Warehouses rose thick, their beams heavy with cargo. Taverns lined the waterfront, their benches full of sailors boasting of storms weathered, of islands glimpsed, of women and wonders in distant ports. Money changers kept tables nearby, weighing coin from Genoa, Lubeck, or Bruges, turning it into local silver. Churches stood close, too, their towers watching over the harbor, bells ringing prayers for safe voyages and tolls for the drowned. To walk a harbor street was to hear the world speaking in many voices at once. Ships carried more than goods. They carried news, songs, rumors, and fear. A sailor might bring word of plague in a southern city, of war between kings, of a new route opened or closed. Foreign words slipped into local tongues, carried home in the mouths of traders. Music crossed the sea in fragments, a tune hummed by one man, learned by another, changed by a third, until it lived as if it had always belonged. Even fear traveled, whispers of sea monsters, of ghostly lights that lured ships to ruin, of phantom fleets seen at dawn. The sea was a trader of tales as much as timber and wool. On land, merchants reckoned profit with coin. At sea, they reckoned it with prayer. Every captain had a small shrine aboard, a painted saint nailed to the mast, a relic hung in the cabin, a cross carved into the deck. Sailors touched these as they passed, muttered oaths before sleep, made the sign of the cross when the wind rose too suddenly. In storm or calm, the sea demanded reverence, and even the boldest pirate spat overboard to appease it. Faith was not ornament at sea, it was ballast, as necessary as rope or sail. When ships returned safe, bells rang, families ran to the quay, and barrels tudded once more onto land. Chests of spice were carried into storerooms, bales of silk unfurled, coins spilled across counting tables. Towns grew fat on these returns, streets paved, churches enlarged, guild halls gilded. The sea was a harsh master, but it paid wages no land alone could match. And so men built ships again and again, stronger, larger, bolder, each new hull a prayer carved in oak and pitch, set afloat with hope. Thus the sea lanes stretched like arteries across the body of the world. They carried life, risk, wealth, and story in equal measure. They linked shores and peoples who might never have touched otherwise, and though storms wrecked ships and pirates stole cargo, though the sea remained as dangerous as it was generous, the lanes endured. For men would always gamble with waves when the reward was spice, silk, wool, or gold. The sea was a road without end, and those who followed it wrote their names upon water, trusting the tide to remember. Trade was never only the careful laying of goods upon scales, the neat entries of ledgers, or the slow passage of carts along rutted roads. It was also wager, peril, and chance. For every bale safely stored in a merchant's hall, another lay at the bottom of a river. For every chest of coin tallied and locked, another vanished with a debtor who fled by night. The wealth of medieval towns was built as much on risk as on certainty, for men knew that fortune was a tide rising swift, falling swifter still. On the roads, bandit haunted the hedges. A caravan laden with salt or cloth was a temptation too strong for hungry men. Guards with spears or crossbows walked at the sides of wagons, eyes sharp, ears tuned to the rustle of leaves. A merchant's purse might hold more than a peasant saw in a lifetime. Its loss was not only personal, but ruinous for a household, a guild, a fair. Yet still the carts rolled on, for risk could be managed but never erased. The gamble lay in setting out at all. At sea, the stakes rose higher. A ship that left harbor might never return. Storms could tear sails to rags, snap masts like twigs, and smash hulls upon hidden reefs. Crews vanished with their cargo, and widows stood at quaysides watching for masts that never appeared. Pirates waited in narrow straits, swift vessels darting out like hawks upon prey. Even lords and kings might seize cargo, declaring it contraband or demanding tolls so steep it might as well be theft. Every voyage was a bet against the sea, and the dice rolled in wind and wave. Merchants learned to hedge their chances. They spread their goods across many wagons, many ships, so that one loss would not empty all their coffers. They joined caravans and fleets, safety in numbers. Some took out early forms of insurance, pooling money so that the misfortune of one could be borne by all. A merchant might even sell a share of his cargo to another, so that profit and peril were divided. Risk taught them fellowship as much as greed, for no man could face fortune's hand alone. Yet the lure of fortune burned brightly. A single cask of spice sold at profit could outweigh the loss of 3 voyages. A lucky bargain at a fair might lift a family from modest comfort to lasting wealth. Tales were told of men who staked everything on one journey and returned with holds so full they bought stone houses, endowed churches, and founded dynasties. These stories fed ambition as surely as bread fed hunger, for in trade, as in dice, The chance of gain was a fire that drew men again and again to the table. Fortune was fickle, but it was also personified. Merchants prayed to saints for safe voyages, to holy protectors of travelers and sailors. They lit candles before setting out, placed relics in their carts, nailed crosses to their masts. Some carried charms, carved stones, coins pierced and worn as talismans, believing that such tokens could turn fate's hand. In guild halls, men pledged alms from future profits if only God would grant success. Faith stood beside risk, for one without the other left the merchant naked before chance. In courts and chronicles, the rise and fall of fortunes became parable. A man who grew rich too swiftly might be envied and cursed, his house burned by jealous hands, or his heirs squabbling to ruin. Another who shared his gains with town and church was praised, his name remembered long after his coin was spent. Fortune could exalt or destroy, and wise men learned to walk humbly even when their purses grew heavy. Yet pride was hard to resist, and many a merchant fell because he thought himself master of chance. Women, too, bore the weight of risk. When husbands were away on voyages, wives kept the ledgers, reckoned with debtors, managed storerooms. A loss at sea or on the road might mean not only sorrow but a struggle to hold house and business together. Widows sometimes proved shrewder than their husbands, keeping trade alive through careful bargains. Others saw everything vanish and were left to beg alms from the very guild that had once toasted their prosperity. Risk touched every corner of the household, not only the merchant's own heart. Even kings and princes played this game. Rulers invested in caravans, lent coin to merchants, levied taxes on trade. Their treasuries swelled when fortune favored them, emptied when storms or wars broke the flow of goods. Armies marched not only for glory, but for tolls, ports, and markets. For whoever held the arteries of trade held the pulse of wealth. Risk at the highest level could alter the fate of realms, just as surely as it altered the fate of a single household. Stories abounded of fortune's cruelty. A merchant who dreamed of wealth drowned within sight of harbor. Another who hoarded silver saw it stolen in a single night. A man who lost everything in one voyage might by luck prosper beyond measure in the next. Fortune's wheel turned without pity, and no man knew when it would lift or cast down. Yet still they set out, still they bargained, still they loaded ships and wagons. For without risk there was no fortune, and without fortune there was no trade. So risk and fortune walked hand in hand, the shadow and the light of commerce. Every coin weighed was a wager, every journey a throw of dice, every bargain a leap across uncertainty. Merchants knew it, priests preached it, and yet the roads and seas never emptied. For men are drawn to fortune as bees to honey, willing to face the sting for the taste. And in that willingness lay the strength of medieval trade, built not only on goods and coin, but on courage enough to risk all for the chance of gain. Not all goods smelled of salt or wool, nor clinked like coin. Some arrived in markets like dreams stepped into daylight, marvels from distant shores that seemed more legend than trade. A chest opened to reveal ivory tusks, smooth and pale as frozen water, carved into shapes of beasts or saints by hands far away. A casket displayed gems, sapphires deep as midnight, emeralds green as spring hedges, rubies burning like captured embers. Falcons hooded in leather blinked with fierce golden eyes, their wings quivering at the leash, as prized for the hunt as silks were for the haul. Furs from the north, thick and glossy, draped over shoulders until even the chill of winter seemed a jest. These were not the burdens of daily life, but treasures for those whose purses could command wonder itself. Ivory came by sea, tusks loaded onto ships in ports where the air rang with drums and the smell of spice. It traveled through many hands, traders who risked storms, merchants who risked thieves, craftsmen who risked their eyesight carving the hard, gleaming surface into reliquaries, crosses, or combs. In churches, ivory shone pure and white, a fitting vessel for holy things. In noble halls, it adorned caskets where jewels were kept, or chessboards where kings and knights battled in miniature. To hold ivory was to touch something that had traveled through worlds most men would never see. Gems, too, told stories. Some came from far India, others from mines hidden in mountains whose names were spoken in hushed tones. Carried in small pouches, they weighed little but commanded fortunes. Jewelers set them into rings, crowns, chalices, their colors flashing in candlelight as if alive. Legends clung to each. Sapphires were said to guard against poison, rubies to burn with the fire of courage, emeralds to soothe the eyes and the heart. Merchants who sold them spoke in low voices, for such wares drew envy as much as desire. A single stone could ransom a lord or ruin a man who trusted the wrong hand. Falcons and hawks came in cages, feathers glossy, talons bound in leather thongs. Noblemen prized them above many treasures, for the sport of falconry was both pastime and symbol of rank. To walk with a hawk upon one's glove was to show mastery, wealth, and favor of fortune. Birds trained for years to hunt hare or duck fetched prices higher than a cart of wool. Their cries rang across markets sharp and wild, reminders that not all treasures were meant to be still. A bird was a living marvel, fierce and fragile, its worth measured in both coin and care. Furs traveled from the north, packed tight in bundles that smelled of pine and snow. Sable, ermine, fox, and marten, each with its own she, its own feel under the hand. Kings wrapped themselves in ermine, its white fur speckled with black, a cloak that spoke of purity and power. Merchants' wives might wear fox, warm and ruddy, while priests lined copes with softer pelts for warmth in cold chancels. To wear fur was to carry a piece of distant forest upon one's shoulders, the wild tamed into comfort. Glass from Venice shone like water caught in foam, goblets thin as petals, windows clear enough to make a man startle at his own reflection. Alabaster from quarries gleamed pale, carved into reliquaries that glowed when candles burned behind them. Fine manuscripts, painted with gold leaf, arrived as gifts or purchases, their pages worth more than a peasant's field. Music itself traveled, strange instruments carried from east or south, their strings or pipes sounding notes unknown to local ears. Exotic marvels came in many guises: stone, skin, feather, sound, light. Each brought a breath of the far world into the heart of the town. Yet wonder carried unease as well. Some whispered that gems hid curses, that ivory was tainted by pagan lands, that falcons carried spirits in their eyes. Priests warned against pride, urging men to remember that treasure was fleeting, that moth and rust, and thieves would claim it all. Still the marvels drew crowds. Even those who could not buy pressed close to glimpse a ruby, to stroke a fir, to breathe the sharp sweetness of frankincense burning in a small brazier. A moment's contact with wonder was its own kind of wealth. Stories of marvels outstripped the goods themselves. Tales spread of spices so bright they glowed in the dark, of birds with feathers like fire, of stones that sang when struck. A merchant might exaggerate the peril of his journey, swearing he had crossed deserts where the sand itself burned, or seas haunted by monsters large as hills. Buyers listened with wide eyes, their desires sharpened by fear, their purses loosened by awe. In this way, wonder itself became part of the trade, bought and sold with every gem and bolt of silk. For the wealthy, marvels became symbols of power. A lord's table glittered with goblets of glass and silver. A lady's gown shimmered with silk embroidered with pearls. Bishops lifted chalices studded with gems, their brilliance meant to reflect heaven's light. Kings offered exotic marvels as gifts, cementing alliances with treasures no local craftsman could fashion. In their gleam lay not only beauty, but authority, the right to command both land and imagination. For the poor, marvels were glimpses of another life. A peasant's child might see a falcon tethered at a fair and carry the memory for years. A mason might glimpse a jewel set in a reliquary and tell his grandchildren of the light that burned in it. Even without ownership, wonder spread, shaping dreams, sparking tales, reminding all who beheld it that the world was vast, and that beauty could be carried across mountains and seas to rest in the palm of one's hand. Thus exotic marvels stood at the far edge of trade. They were not the bread or wool that sustained life, nor the salt that preserved it, but the bright threads that embroidered the fabric of existence. They reminded men and women that the world was larger than their fields, their towns, their kingdoms. And though most would never hold such marvels, the sight of them was enough to kindle wonder, and wonder was a kind of wealth that no thief could steal. ChatGPT said, "Step into a great church, and the weight of treasure pressed upon the senses. Candles flickered against gilded screens, their light mirrored in chalices that gleamed like small suns. Above the altar, reliquaries stood in rows, carved of ivory, chased with silver, crusted with gems. Behind them lay bone, hair, cloth, tokens of saints whose lives were long past, but whose presence lived on in fragments. Pilgrims came with aching feet and worn purses, and the sight of these treasures was both promise and proof that heaven touched earth, that holiness could shine through gold. The wealth of the church was not only in coin or land, but in the goods brought by trade. Incense burned in swinging censers, its smoke curling sweet and sharp into the rafters. The resin had traveled from far deserts, carried in sacks upon camels, passed from hand to hand until it found its way into the hands of acolytes. Wine for Mass came in casks, sometimes from the vineyards of France or Italy, the deep red liquid poured into chalices of hammered silver. Linen for altar cloths, silk for copes and banners, wax for candles, all came by trade, and in their use they were sanctified. Treasuries were guarded with locks and bars. In crypts beneath cathedrals, chests lay heavy with vestments embroidered with gold thread, chalices thick with jewels, patens polished like mirrors. Some had been gifts from kings, seeking favor for battles yet unfought. Others were offerings from merchants, thankful for safe voyages or generous profits, their names recorded in ledgers or carved in stone. The church became a storehouse not only of faith, but of the finest works of craftsmen from across Christendom. A chalice might have been hammered in Cologne, a cope woven in Sicily, a reliquary carved in Paris, all meeting under the same roof. Pilgrims flocked to such places. They brought offerings, sometimes small coins, sometimes goods to be sold by the sacristy, sometimes jewels beyond counting. They knelt before shrines, pressing lips to glass that covered relics, laying candles at altars that already blazed with light. The offerings of many built chapels, raised towers, filled treasuries. Trade fed devotion, and devotion fed trade. For the more splendid the church, the more pilgrims came, and the more goods and coin flowed through its doors. Guilds, too, made their gifts. A guild of weavers might present a great cloth to drape the choir, dyed in their brightest colors, woven with their mark. A guild of merchants might offer a silver lamp to burn before the Virgin statue, its chain heavy, its bowl filled with oil. Each gift was a sign of gratitude, but also a claim to be remembered, to be associated with holiness, to leave a trace of one's labor in a place that touched eternity. Thus the church became a treasury, not only of goods, but of memory. But treasure also carried temptation. There were whispers of relics sold at fairs, of bones passed off as saintly when they were more, of indulgences exchanged for coin more readily than prayers. Some warned that churches grew too rich, their chalices too heavy with jewels, while the poor begged at their doors. Priests defended the splendor, say it was fitting to honor God with the best of earth's goods, that beauty raised hearts to heaven. Yet always there was tension between devotion and display, between holiness and wealth. In times of war, churches became vaults. Lords stored their coin in abbeys, trusting the sanctity of walls more than their own keeps. Merchants hid goods in crypts, praying they would be spared from pillage. Sometimes that trust was rewarded. Other times, soldiers broke doors and carried off chalices, banners, and reliquaries, scattering treasure across fields and markets. Even holy things were not beyond risk, for war made little distinction between sacred and profane. Legends told of treasures hidden, of chalices buried beneath altars to save them from invaders, of reliquaries carried in secret across mountains, of golden lamps walled up and lost for centuries. Pilgrims whispered of miracles tied to such things, a jewel that glowed faintly at night, a relic that healed the sick, a chalice that never ran dry. Treasure became not only wealth, but story, woven into the fabric of faith, shaping the way people saw their world. For the common folk, the treasures of the church were glimpses of heaven. A peasant might labor all year and never hold a silver coin, yet kneel before an altar that blazed with gold. A shepherd's daughter might wear homespun wool, yet see the bishop's cope shimmer with threads of silk and pearl. Such sights stirred both awe and longing, teaching that holiness was rich, but also that richness might be holy. They gave the poor a share in splendor, if only as beholders. Thus the church stood as both house of prayer and house of treasure. It gathered the marvels of distant lands and set them upon altars. It turned trade into liturgy, goods into symbols, wealth into devotion. Its jewels were more than adornment. They were statements of faith, power, and presence. In their gleam, men saw both the beauty of heaven and the burdens of earth, bound together in candlelight. Not all treasure glittered in halls or gleamed on altars. Some lay in silence, hidden in earth, sealed away by hands that feared loss more than they loved display. Buried hoards dotted the countryside, sacks of silver pennies, jars of coins, chests of jewels, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes locked in iron, sometimes forgotten altogether. They were the secret face of trade, wealth withdrawn from the flow of markets and fairs, entrusted to soil as a safer guardian than men. Many hordes were born of fear. When war swept through valleys, when rumors of raiders ran ahead of hoofbeats, merchants and peasants alike dug into the ground. They chose places Hass remembered, under a hearthstone, at the roots of an oak, beside the wall of a barn. There they hid what could not be carried, coin too heavy for flight, silver too tempting for plunderers, heirlooms too precious to risk. Hands trembled as earth was shoveled back. Prayers whispered that the secret might outlast danger. Sometimes the hands that hid it never returned, and the treasure slept for generations. Storms of history left their traces in such hoards. The ground of Europe, turned by plough or spade, yielded coins from kings long dead, their faces worn but still stern, their names circling the edge like faded prayers. A single field might hold hoards from many ages, Roman coins buried in fear of barbarian raids, Saxon silver hidden from Viking sails, medieval pennies tucked away when lords quarreled and borders shifted. Each hoard was a fragment of memory, a frozen moment when someone chose secrecy over trust in their neighbors. Not only war but mistrust bred hoards. Merchants sometimes doubted guild or king, fearing seizure by greedy hands. They would store part of their wealth in walls, in wells, in hidden cellars known only to their household. Apprentices were sent away when such hiding took place. Even wives might be kept ignorant, lest a careless word betray the secret. Silver whispered loud to thieves, and silence was the strongest lock. Yet silence also meant forgetfulness, and more than one hoard was lost because its keeper never lived to reveal the place. Stories clung to hidden treasure. Peasants told of lights that flickered at night above fields where hoards lay, spirits guarding what men had hidden. Some claimed that coins groaned underground, eager to return to the world of trade. Others said the devil himself watched over buried wealth, granting it only to the bold or the foolish. Children were warned not to dig where strange flowers grew, or where soil seemed warmer than the rest, for those were signs of treasure that did not wish to be disturbed. Sometimes hoards returned to light. A plowshare struck metal, a mason found a jar in a crumbled wall, a shepherd uncovered a coin glinting in the earth. News spread fast, and soon the field was crowded with diggers, each hoping for a share. Lords claimed rights over found treasure, guilds argued, priests declared it alms or cursed it as ill-gotten. Yet whatever the quarrels, the silver found its way once more into markets, weighing down scales, filling purses, feeding the endless hunger of trade. But most hoards slept undisturbed. They lay in silence under meadows where cattle grazed, under churches where bells rang, under roads where carts rattled. Seasons passed above them, snow, rain, blossom, harvest. Worms and roots moved slowly around them, yet the coins remained, bright in darkness, waiting. For hoards were patient. They did not spoil like grain or rot like cloth. They endured, a still reservoir of wealth, waiting for accident or fate. To imagine such treasure was to feel both awe and unease. Awe at the thought of so much wealth hidden, unease at the thought that fear had driven it underground. For trade was meant to move, to flow like river or road. Hoards were dams blocking the current, reminders that the world was never safe enough for trust to reign wholly. They were monuments to caution, to secrecy, to the shadow side of fortune. In tales, buried hoards often returned only through suffering. A miser who hid his wealth too carefully was cursed to haunt the spot, his ghost seen bent over the earth. A thief who unearthed coins by night found them turned to stones by dawn. A farmer who stumbled upon treasure grew rich but prideful, only to lose everything in fire or flood. These stories carried warnings that treasure hoarded too closely turned from blessing to burden. that wealth withdrawn from the world carried danger. And yet, even with warnings, men still buried their hoards. The instinct was too strong, the fear too sharp. Better to trust earth than men, better to sleep knowing coin lay hidden than to display it for thieves. So spades struck ground again and again, hoards grew, and the land itself became a treasury, a silent partner in the world of trade. Thus buried hoards remind us that wealth is fragile, always at risk, always shadowed by fear. They are the pause in the song of trade, the silence between bells, the stillness in a world of movement. They teach that trust can falter, that fortune can fail, that sometimes the earth is asked to guard what men cannot. And though they lie unseen, they are part of the story of exchange as much as caravans, fairs, or ships. For trade is it only what is spent and shown, but also what is hidden, waiting in darkness. At the end of the long journey through roads and rivers, through fairs and guild halls, through coins and chests buried in earth stood the truth that trade was more than goods. It was the weaving of lives together, a tapestry stretched across the centuries. Grain-fed bellies, salt-preserved meat, wool clothed the body, spices delighted the tongue, silks dazzled the eye, and silver rang in the hand. Yet beyond all this, trade carried stories, memories, and bonds. It was not only what men bought and sold, but how they touched each other's lives across distance, how villages and kingdoms grew linked in a common rhythm. The road of caravans, the river of barges, the sea lanes of ships, these were only paths for goods, but for people. A drover might never see the sea, yet salt from distant marshes passed through his hands. A sailor might never set foot inland, yet cloth woven in a cottage far away wrapped his shoulders against the spray. Each man or woman became part of something larger, their labor folded into a pattern too wide to see in full. The wheelwright who mended a cart, the shepherd who sheared a fleece, the scribe who recorded a bargain, all were threads in the fabric of trade. Trade also shaped memory. Fairs marked the seasons as surely as harvests, their bustle remembered long after tents were struck. Guild feasts bound generations, fathers and sons seated at the same benches, singing the same songs. A coin might outlast its king, a relic its donor, a buried hoard its owner. The goods themselves might be spent, worn, or lost, but the habits endured, the keeping of measure, the trust in promise, the willingness to risk. These were the true treasures passed on unseen. The church, too, bore this legacy. Its altars gleamed with goods carried across continents. Its prayers rose scented with incense from distant deserts. Its vestments shimmered with silk from far lands. Yet its wealth was more than adornment. It was the testimony that men believed beauty and holiness could travel together, that trade could serve not only hunger and profit, but awe and devotion. The treasures of churches became memories of faith, binding people not only to heaven, but to each other, across parishes and realms. Kings and lords found their power measured in trade. Castles could not stand without stone carried by carts. Wars could not be fought without coin from taxes. Courts could not glitter without silks and gems borne from far away. Rule itself became entangled with commerce, tolls at bridges, tariffs at gates, coinage minted with faces meant to guarantee trust. Power was not only the sword, but the scale, not only the banner, but the ledger. Trade left its mark on crowns as surely as on cottages. And yet, the legacy of exchange was not only wealth and power, it was also imagination. A peasant tasting pepper at a feast imagined deserts he had never seen. A craftsman watching a bolt of silk shimmer in sunlight dreamed of lands where such cloth was born. A child staring at a falcon in the market wondered what forests lay beyond the horizon. Trade widened the world, not only by carrying goods, but by carrying minds outward, past hedges and walls, into the realm of possibility. There were shadows too. Greed, deception, theft, and hoarding haunted the roads as surely as honest toil. Wealth could divide as well as bind, and envy could spark fires as quickly as candles lit in devotion. Yet even in its flaws, trade revealed the common hunger of humanity, the need for sustenance, the longing for beauty, the desire for security, the reach for wonder. These longings tied men and women together more tightly than chains, creating bonds that endured even when fortunes shifted. The legacy endured in silence as much as in noise. In the worn stones of roads smoothed by carts that passed centuries ago, in the riverbanks shaped by barges that once hauled their slow loads, in the ruins of fairs where grass now grows, but where the earth still remembers the tramp of thousands of feet, in the coins unearthed by chance, their faces faint but their weight unchanged, in every town that grew from a cluster of stalls to a city, the ghost of trade still lingers. To lie down at night in a medieval town was to wrapped in this legacy. Bread on the table had been bought with coin earned at the fair. Wool blankets were woven from fleece, carried across moor and meadow. The fire burned with wood bought from a carter, the candle shone with wax, traded by a beekeeper. Even sleep was touched by commerce, for dreams unfolded under roofs raised with timber bought and paid for, by walls laid stone by stone through bargains struck. Thus, the story of medieval trade and treasure is it only the tale of merchants and markets, of caravans and ships. It is the tale of a world woven together by countless hands, of lives joined by goods and by trust, of risks endured and marvels shared. Its legacy is not only the coins in a hoard or the jewels in a chalice, but the simple truth that humanity is bound together by exchange, by giving and receiving, by sharing burdens and blessings, by daring to trust in one another. And when the fair closes, when the ship's sail is furled, when the last candle guttering in the guild hall burns low, that legacy remains. It rests not in the chest or the coffer, but in the memory of voices bargaining, of hands clasping in agreement, of roads worn by countless feet. Trade's true treasure lies in its weaving of lives, a fabric as enduring as any cloak, as vast as any sea, as patient as any road.